Good evening, everybody. My name is Dr. Toby Simpson. I'm the director of the Wiener Holocaust Library, and it's my pleasure to be here with you this evening to host our book talk on Frank Trentmann's Out of the Darkness, the Germans 1942 to 2022. This is a joint event between the Wiener Holocaust Library and the Birkbeck Institute for the Study of Antisemitism. And before we start, I do want to say thank you to the director of BISA, David Feldman, and also to Jan Davidson, who have both played an instrumental role in organising tonight's event. We are delighted to partner with them and would urge you all to look out for future events, either joint events between the Wiener Library and BISA, or indeed BISA's own events programme. For anyone who isn't aware of the Wiener Library, perhaps this is your first time here, the Wiener Library is the world's oldest archive dedicated to the history of Nazi Germany and the Holocaust. It's Britain's largest collection. Our materials range in type over documents, photographs, posters, diaries, letters. We have a very large and diverse archive, most of which is held downstairs. And we also have a free public reading room, which is open to anyone. You don't need to make an appointment. If this is a subject you're interested in, and I suspect it is given the topic of Frank's book, please do visit us and also take advantage of our exhibition and events programme. We are a charity, however, and we would really appreciate your support. So do visit our website where you can give a donation if you feel to do so. It is crucial that we maintain the evidence of the Holocaust, especially today in the context of rising anti-Semitism. So our talk this evening is, of course, about Frank's book, Out of the Darkness, the Germans, 1942 to 2022. And this book is, I think, takes a fascinating perspective on the latter half of the 20th century and the early part of the 21st, in the sense of examining German society in terms of the moral crises and moral dilemmas that German citizens faced and how that impacted on the German sense of identity. And you could argue that Germany today is undergoing a new dilemma and crisis, particularly in the wake of the Russian attack on Ukraine, which prompted Chancellor Olaf Scholz to announce a Zeitenwende, an era of change. So it raises all sorts of questions about Germany's place in the world, which have indeed been intensified since Hamas's terrorist attacks on Israel on the 7th of October last year. So there will be a contemporary focus in today's talk, and yet also speaking to Frank before the talk, we are also going to touch on the beginning of the book, which is, of course, the Wiener Holocaust Library's focus. Starting in 1942, the commencement of area bombing in Germany, at the beginning of the Battle of Stalingrad, the start of Germans in a widespread way asking themselves, in a sense, what have we done? So I'm really fascinated to hear this talk, and I'm just going to say a few words about our speaker. Frank Trentmann is Professor of History at Birkbeck University of London and also at the University of Helsinki. He's the author of a groundbreaking book, The Empire of Things, and also Free Trade Nation. He was a Moore Scholar at Caltech and has been awarded several prizes, including the Whitfield Prize, the Austrian Science Book Prize, the Humboldt Prize for Research, and the 2023 Bochum Historians Prize. And so it's my pleasure to welcome Frank Trentmann. I'd like you all to join me in welcoming to speak to us this evening.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction and indeed for the invitation. It's a special pleasure to be here today, and that's not just because it's the shortest walk to any event I had to take, because I'm literally two buildings from the left. But you know, the Wiener Library is such an important public space as well as a research institution that for scholars, modern history, contemporary historians, it is absolutely vital. And so is the public work that's being done by the Birkbeck Institute for the Study of Antisemitism. And I'd like to thank both institutions and the directors, and indeed the volunteers who are helping with this event. Now, what I like to do really with this talk is to use this history, which looks at 80 years of the lives of Germans from the middle of the Second World War to the Russian attack on Ukraine, to shed some light on the present. And so basically, I'm asking two questions. I want to explore two questions. One is, how did the Germans become who they are today? How effectively, how does a society evolve from being supporters of Hitler to the society they are today? And then secondly, I want to ask what the legacy of some of the moral dilemmas and challenges, the successes, but also the limitations are for how Germany stands today in the world. Now, in the book, I tell this story as one which leads to ever deeper moralization of life. What do I mean by that? What I mean by that is that by the end of the book, so basically where we are today, there's hardly a topic, social or political or cultural topic in Germany, which is not very quickly moralized when people are having a debate. How do I know this? Well, when I started working on the book, we were in autumn 2015, the so-called refugee crisis, where under then Chancellor Angela Merkel, almost 1 million refugees were entering Germany by the end of the year. And in autumn 2015, you had, for example, a Green member of parliament in parliament announcing how Germans can be proud now that they're world champions of human compassion. At the same time, you have talk about Germany being a peace power. Germans are the drivers of the so-called Energiewende, which supposedly leads the world to a sustainable future. They always save and never supposedly run into debts. That's what the Greeks do. And so once you start scratching, you realize economic, political, social topics are quickly moralized. So I started being interested in where does this come from? The initial hunch, which I think is probably the dominant view in a lot of German media, is you don't need to write a book. You just need to say 1968. The idea that a new young generation of Germans suddenly confronted the crimes of their fathers. They realized, particularly in West Germany, how lucky they were. They got off the hook for awful war crimes and the Holocaust, and instead were allowed to have an economic miracle, join the West, be democratic, and have a carefree life. And so deep down in the subconscious in this argument, people felt shame and needed to demonstrate to the rest of the world that they had overcome all the past failings. And so after 1968, in that argument, morality becomes a way to show the world we are good people again. That looks sort of attractive if you first hear it. The problem with it is that the moral reorientation and the energy released by struggles over questions like fairness, solidarity, but also reparations, of course, starts well before 1968. So 68 is really pretty much a chapter in an ongoing story. And I would argue that while it's not unimportant, 1968 in Germany, it's pretty much running in a half-open door that had already been opened by civil society groups active in the 1950s. So what I want to do today is look at some of these historical dynamics that produce this moral energy, the dilemmas and the contradictions arising from it, and then locate the present. And so I want to start where the book starts in the winter of 1942-43, and then look at some particular themes, peace, versus military values. And then I want to look at Germans' difficulties with strangers, other types of lifestyles, which will also bring me to the topic of anti-Semitism. And then I want to say a few words about East and West, because of course, for half the time in this book, Germany was divided into a democratic West and into a socialist East. Now, why does the book start in the winter of 1942-43 rather than in 1945, the so-called Hour Zero? And there are really two reasons for that. The first is that the people I'm dealing with who are emerging from the Second World War did not come with a clean slate in 1945. They both brought to the post-war world the crimes they had committed, as well as the pain they themselves had suffered. And they didn't just strip that off at the moment of defeat. But more importantly, as I was sort of working in the archives, it became clear that certain questions, uncertainties, dilemmas had already been posed in 1943 and 1944, so that people were already, as the war, not everyone, but a growing number of people were already asking themselves moral questions about their own role in the war that are important to consider if we want to understand how a society regrouped itself and remade their identities. And so I just want to read one short passage from 1943 and 1944 to give you a little bit of sense of what this emerging soul searching sounded like. And so I start in spring of 1943, so a few months after the defeat at Stalingrad, and as aerial bombings is intensifying on German cities. And we're in Halle, which is in the Prussian province of Saxony, where opinion was split about what to do. Between these, what I'm going to read to you, all comes from notes recorded by the security service of what local voices were saying in different towns and communities. So in Halle, public opinion was split between those who wanted to kill the Jews and those who said that if the Germans had not attacked the Jews in the first place, they would already be enjoying peace. The shock of Stalingrad has still not faded away. The district president of Swabia in the south observed in June 1943, and there were fears Russians might kill German prisoners of war in revenge for German mass executions of Jews in the East, quote. By 1944, the security branch in Stuttgart criticized Nazi propaganda about the Red Army massacre of German civilians in Nemmersdorf, which is now in Lithuania, the first village in East Prussia to fall to the Soviets because it so easily backfired. Numerous voices in the population were saying, every thinking person who sees the blood sacrifice will immediately think of the atrocities that we have committed in enemy lands, indeed, even in Germany itself. Have we not slaughtered the Jews in their thousands? Do soldiers not report again and again that Jews in Poland had to dig their own graves? And what we have done to the Jews in Alsace, in the concentration camps? Jews are human too. Thus, we have shown the enemies how they can treat us if they win. That was a lot of we's. The sense of complicity for crimes committed in their name was now spreading among those on the home front. So these are the voices. So, I mean, several things to note. One is just how openly people talked about, some groups talked about complicity and how much knowledge was circulating. That knowledge was not yet framed as the Holocaust, as we call it today, but clearly plenty of talk about mass executions and other crimes. So what's going on here? Well, effectively, after Stalingrad, German society is increasingly in a moral pressure cooker, and we're seeing extremes of opinions. On the one side, there are people now saying, well, of course we're being bombed. We started it. Now we're being punished. We shouldn't really have done what we did when the deportations were happening, or we should have kept some of the Jews in our town. So that's sort of one view. On the other hand, you have the polar opposite view, which is the kill the Jews quote in what I just read, where people are saying, well, actually, Goebbels and Hitler's, they're right. The Bolshevik Jews American conspiracy is trying to eliminate all Germans. So we must now really be absolutely ruthless and kill the last few remaining Jews. So those are the two polar opposites. The churches are in the middle. They're saying, yes, we're guilty, and that's why we're being bombed. But the guilt is otherworldly. It's because we haven't been Christian enough. We haven't gone to church enough. We haven't prayed enough. So it's a relationship between the individual and God rather in this world. But what you have in this moral pressure cooker is a growing number of people asking themselves for the first time uncomfortable questions of what might happen if Germany does not win the war. Now, the war isn't lost in 1943, but for the first time, there are voices who are saying, well, we may not win the war. And if we don't win the war, we may have to face up to what we've done. I have some jokes. Germans do jokes, but they're on the dark side in this book. And one joke from spring 1943 is recorded by a school teacher who said, well, the neighbor just told my wife a new joke. Do you know the shortest joke? Wir siegen, we are winning. This is spring 1943. The same teacher does not know whether his son is still alive in captivity or killed in Stalingrad. And it produces long entries suddenly in his diary where he's asking himself all sorts of uncomfortable questions, such as, the leaders of this world are really evil, but who's the more evil one? Who's the source of evil? Is it Stalin, as we're told, or is it perhaps Hitler, after all? This is a man who in 40, 41, 42 is cheering on Hitler as the greatest military leader and statesman the world has ever seen. He's so proud of his colleagues who are young enough to fight in the war. But then Stalingrad happens and he doesn't know the fate of his son. And he suddenly thinks to himself, well, are we actually, what is this war about? Why are wonderful German sons and brothers like my own being sacrificed? Sacrificed for what? Is it a just war? What actually are the war aims? Things that hadn't appeared in the diary beforehand. This is a teacher who starts in 41, 42 to write confidential reports on what neighbors, school teachers, pupils are saying in his town, Oldenburg and in Lower Saxony, after Stalingrad. He, within half a year, he decides, well, he's not going to wear the party sticker, the party button any longer. He will not hoist the swastika flag until his son is safely back home. And he stops writing confidential reports to the security service. By 44, early 45, the same person who's cheered on German troops has convinced himself that actually he never really was a supporter of Nazi Germany. He always had doubts about the whole project. And I think while he's not representative of all Germans, there's a growing number of people like that. And it's important to understand that, because it helps us understand the transition after 45 to a different society. Here were people who had rearranged their biography and their identity to accommodate themselves to new realities. And in the course of that, they'd also rearranged their own past. So there are important tensions already going on in 43 and 44, which I think are very, very important to understand. Now, one big challenge after the Second World War is about the future or nature of the army and military life. So in the early 50s, the question of rearmament almost tears West Germany apart. You have the biggest demonstrations in history in many cities against rearmament. You have attempts by various cities to have plebiscites to derail Adenauer's policy to introduce a new army. But the new army is introduced in West Germany and then also in East Germany. And that means you have a debate, what kind of army will this new army be? And you have rival factions in the Bundeswehr, in the West German army, about what it means to be a soldier in democratic society. And alongside, you have a growing peace movement. So already before the Easter marches, but then in the Easter marches in the early 60s, and then on into the 70s and 80s with mass demonstrations and blockades of nuclear weapons, where peacefulness is now identified as a core German value. And these tensions, I think, are important to understand if you want to understand why Germany was so conflicted and remains very conflicted about the appropriate policy towards Ukraine in the current war. So I'm just going to read you voices from the two sides. The first one is from 1983 and comes from a place called Mutlangen, which is near Stuttgart, sort of southwest, where NATO tries to station nuclear rocket heads. And several thousand people gather outside the barracks to blockade the entry of military vehicles. The police comes for several days, including Heinrich Böll, a Nobel Prize winner of literature, and many other luminaries, as well as ordinary people. They're having sort of a sit-down blockade. They're being removed by police and have to go to trial. They're being charged. And the trials are an opportunity for these protesters to give their view of why they were involved in civil disobedience. And these are not just 68ers or young people, they also involve members of the older generation, such as a woman called Meta Lamberts, who was born in 1936. So we're 1984 when the trial happens. And she describes to the judge how peace was really a learning process for her and came fairly late in life. She explains that she belonged to an older generation of teachers for whom it was natural to resort to the occasional slap in the face of pupils when she was teaching. I am an apolitical person who tends to trust blindly in authority, she said. But then it was the declaration of the Council of Churches in 1981 and the arms race that woke her up. She felt she needed to do something, especially in light of people's complicity in the Nazi era. So she joined boycotts against South African products, But then she realized that as a taxpayer, she was implicated personally in the arms buildup. I cannot leave these things to the politicians. I must involve myself, she explained. And so she began taking 5 marks and 72 pfennigs off her automobile tax, 1 penny per Pershing 2 or cruise missile. You have a sort of small movement that which you know the judges and lawyers just think this is misunderstanding how taxes work, but it's very important for them. But you see here this idea, this is not something external, politicians, ministers, civil servants, generals, but actually as a citizen, you were implicated. And that becomes a problem because the past, Nazi Germany, is now seen in terms of complicity. So not just a few bad Nazis and other Germans who couldn't do anything, but German society is now seen as having been complicit, and that has lessons for the present. So that's the peace people, and we have a lot. I mean, we have a very rich literature, and if you look at sort of survey text on post-war Germany, it can look like everyone joins the peace movement, everyone's on an Easter march, all Germans are on the barricades in '68, everyone's progressive and liberal, and things become ever better. And what that misses out is the fact that actually the largest number of young men do military service. It's a small minority that become conscientious objectors, and they have written about that. But it raises the question, well, what does war and peace mean for the millions of people who do compulsory military service? And just as it happens, in the military archive, the Federal Archive with military sources in Freiburg, you have a large cache of essays written by sergeants, young sergeants in the early 60s, who had to go to seminars and then write essays on questions such as, what is a good soldier? Or, what's your view about Stauffenberg's attempt to assassinate Hitler on the 20th July 1944? Or tell us about your favorite book and what you like about it, things like that. And so we have essays from these soldiers which give us an insight in just how varied attitudes to war and peace remain by the early 60s. So one soldier said, well, Hitler might have waged an unjust war, but the soldiers' values lived on: courage, obedience, loyalty, a sense of duty and camaraderie. Others said that in the Second World War, soldiers' actions had been clean, and all Germans now, including conscientious objectors, should feel great pride in how German soldiers had resisted the large enemy so courageously. One Bundeswehr soldier's favorite book was a war novel about a group of fighter pilots. What he liked about it, he explained, was that the men knew that they were serving a cause which was condemned to fail, but nonetheless kept fighting to the end. Their sense of honor and shame gave them composure, Haltung is the German word, and made them the inner victors. A very common trope. The idea is, Germany might have lost the war, but German soldier was the inner victor because they fought on. The tough, selfless soldier was needed more than ever to halt the avalanche from the east. The middle classes, another said, were too well fed, degenerate, remote controlled by various interests. Classic anti-Semitic trope. You have people, I could go on, you have people writing their own poems on how heroic German soldiers were. One lieutenant wrote on the question of war crimes and human rights conventions. He said, well, In battle, this is 1962, in battle, his first obligation is to his men and his troops. If some people from some village fired at them, of course they go in and root out the whole village. There is no such thing, he said, as law at a time of war. So you have, interestingly, within the army itself, you have this battle over what is it to be a virtuous soldier. This stretches from people who want to reform the army, who are talking about citizens in uniform, who are stressing that a criminal order needs to be resisted by soldiers on the one hand, and then you have generals who really think these democratic reforms are undermining the fighting spirit of an army and are trying to resist. And it's only under Helmut Schmidt in the early mid-70s that this is resolved towards the democratic side. In the East, in East Germany, the situation is much, much simpler because not only do you have the Nationale Volksarmee and compulsory service, but the state views battle as a natural attribute of what a good socialist citizen should be doing. And hence children are taught how to lob hand grenades and have endurance marches and things like that. So military spirit and aggression is much more widespread in East Germany, which, as a small footnote, raises actually interesting question on why so many people today in East Germany are so fearful of war, because literally for 30 years, the overwhelming spirit was militaristic. Now let me turn to the relationship between Germans and others. And by that I mean both strangers, but also migrants and people of other faiths and ideas within society. In 1957, in the city of Offenburg, in a pub, a man called Sint, who had far too many drinks, I mean, something like, 5 whiskeys and 6 pints of beer and half a bottle of wine, so heavily drunk, walks over to a table where a, in quotes, half-Jewish camp survivor is sitting, this is 1957, and tells him in a loud voice that Jews were to blame for the collapse of Weimar. And it's a sad thing that this man didn't also go up and smoke. Drunk, goes home. Some people in present mention this. He's a school teacher, which means he's a civil servant. School teachers are civil servants. Some parents in the school ask for conversation to clarify the situation. School director doesn't do much. Some people really concerned then go up to the next level in the bureaucracy and talk to the regional ministry involved. Nothing much happens. Sint continues to teach, and it's then newspapers which learn of this story and publicize what was going on, what was being said in this public space in an inn in 1947. And it's then that the situation explodes. People in Offenburg feel they're being put under sort of national and international scrutiny, as if Offenburg is a sort of haven for anti-Semitic people. And it's only then, when this really reaches French and British newspapers, that action is being taken and Sint is removed. But he's allowed to slip away and then actually starts teaching, I think in Libya, until his death. But it raises the question, which at that point was very embarrassing for many Germans and continues to be, how much anti-Semitic prejudice and activism actually survived. After the attack by Hamas after 7th of October, there was widespread silence in society, and it needed a few weeks for politicians to speak up about what was happening, as within Germany you had anti-Semitic attacks. And the main word that German politicians, including Chancellor Scholz, used was, we should be ashamed that this shouldn't be happening in Germany. And I remember when this happened, I, as a historian, thought, well, yes, of course you should be ashamed, but actually, this is the same speech pattern every single chancellor since Adenauer has been using since the 50s. We have renewed anti-Semitic attacks, and then politicians say, well, we should be ashamed. This is impossible. This can't be happening, shouldn't be happening in Germany. But of course it is happening. The interesting thing is how much within the West German narrative of their own country, with the attention given to memorial culture, remembrance, reckoning with the past, that has been conflated with, well, anti-Semitism must be declining because of it, as if one necessarily leads to another. And in that success story, many stages of anti-Semitic violence were either forgotten or marginalized, such as what happened in 1980, when a group of fascists murdered the publisher Shlomo Levin, and his friend, just went to his villa and shot them. You have a whole series of anti-Semitic attacks that follow. So in many ways, what we've seen since October, yes, there has been a rise if you look at the numbers, but in spirit, really, there's a long history. And the thing to note is that in spite of reparations and memorial culture, anti-Semitism never really went away, either in West or in East Germany. Just to give you a few figures on just how widespread it is, in 2020, 1/4 of West Germans surveyed and 1/3 of East Germans agreed with the statement, the Jews have something peculiar about them and do not quite fit in with us. In a West German school in northern part of Germany, Nordenham, these are 15, 16-year-olds, 1 in 8 students said that Jews have too much influence in the world. If you look at voters for the populist right-wing Alternative for Germany, Alternative für Deutschland, it's actually over 50% who agree with that statement. This is, this is sort of 2020, 2021 data, and 1 in 7 pupils also agree with the statement that Hitler and the Nazis had their good sides, in quotes. So I think, the minute you recognize that memory and memory politics, particularly once it becomes ritualized in annual speeches or ceremonies, is one thing, but action is another. It's actually possible to explain this disjuncture. So memory of something that happened in the past does not automatically translate into action here and now. And the reason for that is that throughout this whole period, we see a tug of war between initiatives trying to cultivate, we would now say, empathy, so a spirit of compassion, the facility of putting yourself into the shoes of another person, someone you may never have met. So you see big initiatives in the 50s, 60s, and early 70s over world hunger, third world politics, also questions on asylum and the treatment of refugees. So to give one example, mid-1950s, you have schools, many schools in Munich, collecting money and making handicraft little soap bags and things like that to send to children in poor areas in Egypt. So you have that. It's accompanied by school texts and also short films and other information to try and make these Munich school children understand what it must be like to live in Egypt in a poor area. So you have that, but at the same time, you have schools, other schools in Munich, where both directors and teachers and parents are firmly convinced, no, this is a waste of time. We should think about us first, us Germans, the poor people in our midst, perhaps, and if we need to, the people fleeing East Germany, looking for a new life in West Germany. So you have this tug of war that's ongoing, and you see it in debates over the treatment of so-called guest workers in the West or contract workers in the East throughout the 70s and 80s. So I don't think it should be that surprising. Let me turn to East and West. One question, of course, I asked myself throughout this book, because I go through the so-called three Germanys. So I have Nazi Germany, I have East and West, and then I have reunified Germany, is to what extent the German Democratic Republic in its 40 years managed to produce a different kind of morality. Did a socialist regime and living under socialism produce different norms and different forms of moral action? Walter Ulbricht, the head of state, of that state, in the 60s, went so far that he produced the 10 socialist commandments. So Bible and churches are out. Socialism needs its own commandments, which he proclaimed and distributed, and they were basically asking people to put their own individual self-interest always, make that always subordinate to collective sacrifice for socialist solidarity within East Germany, but also to support socialist freedom movements, freedom fighters in the rest of the world. And the idea was that people needed to learn to put their own so-called petty bourgeois materialist interests by the side and realize that the collective interest matters much more. So how much of that did they manage to produce? We have a number of different sources which we can investigate for that purpose. One very, very big one are the so-called petitions. The GDR gave citizens the right to send their complaints or suggestions to both socialist companies, organizations, but also to the government and to the ruling party itself. And so by the early mid-1980s, that means several 100,000 people are writing what really annoys them and what they think should be done to Honecker and the various other ministers. So we have a fairly good sense of what's considered right and wrong by citizens and how they try to communicate that. And I just pick out one petition, which comes from a worker who is a volunteer on a so-called conflict commission. Since socialism resolves conflict between people, the GDR had so-called conflict commissions, where neighbors or parties who were in some dispute or conflict would meet so that the volunteers on the commission could persuade them to put their own particular egotistical interest to the side and come to some understanding. So it wouldn't go to the courts and need more serious action. And so this man had been, he thought, a good socialist citizen doing his bit. But then in 1977, he gets a note in his postbox saying, a parcel was sent to you from West Germany and we've confiscated it. from the Stasi, from the intelligence service. And he asked himself, well, what could that be? So he asked, why did you take my parcel away? And he gets the answer, well, your parcel had 2 items which were fascist in nature. The first one was a beach ball with a Western logo, something like Nivea or so. And the second was a photo album from the recent Olympics in 1976, where the GDR just took all the gold medals, really. But it had an introduction by a West German sports journalist. And he's at a loss. And he goes to his factory and he talks to all his comrades and says, well, we don't understand it. I mean, it's not that we had sort of militaristic literature or Mein Kampf by Hitler or something like that. This is a beach ball and pictures of athletes at the Olympics. And he just at the end decides, no, look, I can't, this doesn't make sense to me. I can't just, if I don't have rights, he concludes, I don't want to have any duties either. And that's it. This is 1977. He just draws a line and basically leads a private life without engagement with the Socialist Party. That's one example. Teenagers, as we all know, are fascinating individuals, and so they are in East Germany as well. In 1985 in Magdeburg, so we have 4 years before the fall of the wall. No one knows the wall is falling. There's one school class of 15-year-olds. So these are the children of Honecker who are sitting in a classroom waiting for their teacher, but the teacher is ill. So they get a new substitute teacher who arrives in class, hasn't had any time to prepare, and has the idea, okay, you're going to write an essay. And the question is, imagine what will the future be like in 30 years from now? And so they all spend an hour writing their essays, except one pupil who's a punk who says, I don't do anything. But everyone else writes this essay, and we have these essays from 1985. And except for one pupil who gives kind of standard slogans about socialist peace, and how it will make the future better, the world a better place. All the other children's are flying around to New York, are shopping in Paris, having a villa. The husband always has a Mercedes. The women, interestingly, in spite of what we're always told about gender equality, all the women either are at home with 2 children and a dog, or they're secretaries in an anteroom to their husband's big office, or they become hairdresser. So, but basically, this is a shopping, holiday, skiing fantasy. And it really raises the question of how different these children really are from the ones who were going to school west of the Elbe in capitalist West Germany. So the short is, GDR started out with tremendous socialist ambition. And in the early 50s, there was a certain utopian enthusiasm that made it attract considerable support. But certainly after the wall was built in the early 60s, and then under Honecker, most of those moral ideals are being sold out and discredited. Let me see whether, yes, I think you need to hear from Katja Kramer. Just my last short passage of text to take us into the fall of the wall and reunification. A colleague in Potsdam, at the moment you had mass demonstrations calling for calling for reform, which ultimately led to the fall of the wall and then a year later to reunification. A colleague in Potsdam had the ingenious idea of selecting citizens, East German citizens, to start writing a diary during this period. So we can follow how, this is mainly women, how these women experienced the time from autumn 1989 to reunification and immediately after. And these diaries are collected and give us a kind of snapshot of the moral and personal upheaval people went through. And so my last extract is from one of them, Katja Kramer, who was 36 when her country, where she had grown up, disappeared. And in many ways, she was a model of the professional woman in the GDR. She was a single mother. She was a trained engineer. And in 1987, she was promoted to join a group working on computer technology, which looked really great in 1987. But by 1990, a chip produced by an East German factory has no chance in the world market compared to what's being produced in the West. So she is being told by her bosses that job cuts are probably around the corner. And so in September 1990, she's sitting at an unemployment office, out of work and humiliated. And in her diary, she records the new reality that devalued everything she had accomplished in her life. The forms she had to fill in at the unemployment office were based on a West German lifestyle. For instance, she was asked whether she had attended a gymnasium. That's a selective type of school which didn't exist in East Germany. And quote, whether I had studied outside the Federal Republic. Now, boy, she did grow up there. She writes, they want to extinguish us completely. I attended a polytechnic secondary school, POS, and an extended secondary school, EOS, in the GDR. And I see no reason to hide that. I'm proud of it. Why do they refuse to recognize that? It makes me want to throw up. In a few months, the joy of November, so the fall of the wall, and the feeling of community and confidence had given way to a sense, she writes, of anger and powerlessness. 1990 for her was a nosedive that ended with the haggling for our souls. The 2nd of October, the last day of the GDR, was, she writes, one of the blackest days of my life. She felt like a convict awaiting execution, expelled, a stranger in my own country, unspeakably sad. No work, no love, no Heimat, homeland, no happiness. Just before midnight, she put on the national anthem to thank her fatherland for all that was good and beautiful in the last 36 years. It is like a funeral, she wrote. So it gives you a sense of this tremendous enthusiasm when we are the people and the fall of the wall, and then how quickly, with the currency union, unemployment, challenges to your identity and lifestyle start to raise a question where this is going. And in many ways, this harsh experience of the 1990s has really left a very, very long emotional and psychological shadow on the present. So it doesn't matter if you look for economic data, the life chances, health, longevity, income patterns, employment patterns, all these things have actually converged. But if you ask people about their identity, whether they think they're being accepted or not, it seems as the two sides have diverged further and further. And so we have an excellent set of interviews and surveys from a youth research center in Leipzig, which has been asking young Germans always the same question since 1989. The question is, how long do you think will it take for the two parts to really come together, sort of hearts and minds? And in 1989, 1990, it said, 5 years. And then by 1995, it became 10 years. 2000 became 20 years. And we're currently at, the expectation is 30 years, even though there has been material convergence. So let me just end by pointing out a few direct, I think, implications for where we are today. The director already mentioned Scholz, Chancellor Scholz, pronouncing a Zeitenwende and sort of an era of change in February 1922. But the question is, how much has Wende, it means turning, how much actually has Germany turned? And how much is it capable of turning? And I would probably briefly emphasize 4 very deep divides that are running through the country, and each of these divides is basically a tension between moral ideas accumulated through the past and real world challenges that have emerged in the last few years. The first one is economic. That's the so-called debt break. Germans thought it was very clever to specify a ceiling of limiting the amount of debt you can add every year into the constitution. That's become literally a corset in a recession that the country is going through, because you can't spend your way out, because that would mean taking on debt. So that's a serious tight corset, and it exists because debt is evil. Saving is good, debt is evil. Only profligate Mediterraneans go in debt, and British people who spend on their credit cards. I mean, that's the popular narrative. So virtuous behavior means no debt. The German saying is, man macht keine Schulden. And that's being applied to public policy. That's a serious problem. The second is Germany and the world. And that relates not just to Ukraine, but also to China. In the decades after the Second World War, Germans got into the habit of eating their cake and wanting their cake and eating it too. And that was possible because responsibility and spending and resources were outsourced, mainly to the United States. Ukraine raises serious problems with regard to that, because Ukraine is dependent on military support, and it will be a big question, I think, if Trump wins the election, whether Germany or Europe alone can step up what they're doing currently. China is particularly interesting from a moral point of view, because you have, on the one hand, a foreign policy and a foreign secretary who speaks very openly about the need to adhere to human rights and stand up to human rights. But at the same time, of course, in the last few years, you've seen more and more German investment in China. And not all that investment is in places or for products which entirely satisfy human rights standards. So you have a direct conflict of this interest. And the third, and probably for us here today, one of the most interesting conflicts and tensions is that between a public and official memory culture and opinions within society over the current conflict in the Middle East. You will all have come across in British media the term Staatsräson is the official German term, so reason of state, literally, that the defense of Israel is an essential part of German policy, and ministers and all parties have vehemently supported that view. The problem with that view is that the defense of Israel is often equated with the defense of anything an Israeli government or an Israeli or the Israeli army does. And the problem with that is that within society, you have a growing dissent with that official position. And it comes from different quarters. One is the argument that this narrow definition marginalizes or blocks out attention to other human rights violations. That's sort of one position. And one hears a lot about that because that's connected to whether demonstrations are allowed or what's being said at the Berlinale film festival or things like that. Just as important, I think, is to point out that the largest group, according to surveys, the largest group of Germans take a different conclusion from the current conflict. Their conclusion is, yes, perhaps, I mean, yes, they would say Germans have a special responsibility, historic responsibility that arises from the crimes committed in the Second World War and the Holocaust, but this significant group takes the conclusion that that means you should stay out of any conflict whatsoever. So their argument is the German government actually is moving in the wrong direction. Their view is what Germany should be doing, it should just retreat. It should just care about its own domestic problems and leave the problems of the world to anyone who wants to have a problem. So and you get then lines, well, Middle East is always a problem, there's always conflict, war, what has it got to do with us, Germans? I think that's a very significant opinion. And together, the critics who feel that the suffering of the Palestinians is ignored by the German government, and the people who are far more numerous who say Germany should just completely stay out of the Middle East, that will create, I think, problems for any government, German government, as the war continues, and will undermine the credibility of the German government, not just internationally, but I think also domestically. The very last point is East and West, which is connected to what I just said, because there has now been a tendency with the continued strength of the populist right, the Alternative for Germany, for many Germans to turn inwards again. Focusing on what they see as the most pressing problems, which is what will happen in the former East. Will the Populist Party win a majority? How are we going to tackle this? Should we take constitutional or legal steps? Should one talk to these populists or should one exclude them? And my point is not so much that one strategy is better than the other, but a slightly larger point, which is what we're currently seeing is a potentially dangerous mode, which we've seen repeatedly in the post-war decades, where Germans turn inward as if the rest of the world and the problems of the world do not concern themselves, and they should primarily focus on domestic issues. And I think that would be a serious problem, not just for Germany, but for Europe and also the world. Stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Frank. So we now do have an opportunity for a Q&A. I will open the floor. I do have a question myself, but I'm happy to hand over to the floor in the first instance if we have some questions. Oh, yes, we have a colleague here who has a mic, but perhaps I can lend mine if you've got one closer. So I'll hand mine over to you, sir, to start.
Thank you very much. Thank you for that. It was fascinating. I mean, there's so much ground to cover that I feel like we've only scratched the surface to get your book. The question I have is, there are a lot of people who have a deep-seated prejudice against German citizens and believe that what happened in 1933 to 1945 could only have happened in Germany. And I don't particularly subscribe to that view, but I'm wondering whether that's something that you touch on in your book, whether it's about the German character or about the social, political, and cultural situation at the time. Why was it Germany, and could it have happened anywhere else?
Shall I take
Yes,
that?
yes, I think so.
Now you have time for a second seminar. No, thank you, thank you. Now that's I mean, that is a question that's not just been asked by historians or by other people, but the interesting thing is that is also being asked towards the end of the Second World War by Germans themselves. And so my historian, I can give you my view, which is that well, nothing is predetermined in history, but 1933 and certainly the Holocaust are not predetermined. But that does not mean that Germany was not already a fertile ground for extremism and perhaps particularly vulnerable to fascist takeover. But it needed the elites. I mean, I think that's very important. If the elites towards the end of Weimar had been different-minded elites, well, 1933, for instance, may not have happened. What's interesting, I think, is how the Germans themselves, towards the end of the war and in the post-war years, think of this question, because they're asking that, why did this happen in Germany? And the question to them is related, how responsible are we, or other factors that are responsible? And it almost tears the churches apart. In 1948, the Protestant churches arrive at a confession, which important in the context is this is partly a meeting with Protestant churches from other countries. So they're trying to come up, this is what we think. And it's a finely worded compromise where they say, well, we have to acknowledge we are guilty. We are guilty. We could have done more. And it causes a storm. And so you have many people writing to bishops and saying, what is this? This is smearing the German character. What about appeasement? Surely Chamberlain has as much fault, and so you have debate about the causes. But the interesting thing emerging from these debates is that post-war German society, while there is more talk about guilt than I think people recognize, they retreat into a narrative of spiritual or metaphysical guilt. So yes, this happened in Germany, or was acted out and committed the crimes by Germans, but there's a spirit behind it, people argue, which is that of evil modernity. So this is not something peculiarly German, they argue, but how modern society has lost its anchor and its orientation, and that allowed evil spirits like Hitler to take over. And I just give you one short example, because I remember when I read that in the sources, it just made me sort of gasp. How widespread this view was. In the 1950s, you have sociologists trying to understand how the family is changing. So they interview lots of people. So one sociologist meets with a civil servant and his wife, and they talk about family relations and education and so forth. And then towards the end of the interview, he says, tell me, what's your view of the future? Are you optimistic? Are you pessimistic? And they both say, future? I don't think there will be a future. And the sociologist says, wait a minute, what do you mean? Well, it's looking very dark. And they say, well, what do you think is behind that? Do you mean Hitler? And the husband says, psh. He says, well, what do you mean? And the husband says, no, it's not Hitler. It goes further. It goes back further. And so the person says, oh, you mean the French Revolution? He says, no, even further. Somewhere in the early modern period, these evil forces were gathering control over our minds. And, you know, the first time you read this, you think, are they crackpots or what? And then you look and you see, you know, the flood of books being published about the evil of modernity, mind control of evil forces, and so forth. And it makes perfect sense once you think about it, because suddenly directly attributable actions and consequences, you know, person X did this to person Y, are being elevated to this diffuse atmosphere where you can't any longer pinpoint who is evil. And it's a way of exculpation. It's many people saying, well, it's not individuals who did this, they're deeper forces. So I think that's interesting. And it means it deflects from what we as historians would see factors in national history to some metaphysical level.
I think we'd be happy also to gather a couple of questions. So if you are wanting to ask a question, please just raise your hand. Yes, we'll gather a couple. So this lady here first, and also we'll take one from you.
Coming back to the end of your lecture and Germany sort of looking inward, how would you comment on John Kampfner's remark in his latest book that Germans should take off their straitjacket and actually become responsible for what they're doing? I mean, and that's not just the Holocaust, but that, you know, their outlook and dealing with their country and development. You know, because it's always a sort of, could be seen as a sanctimonious escape almost.
Thank you for that. We're just going to gather one more question, and then Frank, I'll turn over to you.
You paint a rather gloomy picture at the end of your talk there, yet your book is entitled Out of the Darkness. So I'm quite interested why you think it's out of the darkness, given your remarks at the end.
Thank you.
Out of the darkness is where the society was coming from. It doesn't say into the light. So there's room to maneuver, and in a way the title tries to leave open, well, out, but to where? And I think so. The book is not a success story. I mean, I'm quite happy to talk about successes, but I think the narrative we had, particularly of West Germany, as having reached, you know, economically powerful, democratically sound and stable, good international partner, that's far too simple. And so I think there are shadow sides, and one indeed relates to your question, which is about responsibility and role in the world. I mean, the one thing I've been asking me, and which I think is a clever idea, you know, when people talk about complicity, and they, in the context of the Germans, they instantly draw a line to the question of, well, what did Germans know and what did they do in the Second World War and in the Holocaust? And that's very, very important. But of course, complicity is not limited to war crimes and crimes against humanity. You have complicity in all sorts of other situations. So one thing I've been mulling over is to what degree the reckoning with complicity in relation to the war and a war of extermination, Holocaust, left traces in Germans thinking differently about responsibility on other questions. And probably the biggest one is climate crisis. So Germany is a country which is export world champion, has very large share of industry powering away, and wants to be at the same time leader of energy transitions and sustainability. And so you have an odd sort of tangle of, on the one hand, people being extremely environmentally conscious, a green party, not just in parliament, but in government, all sorts of initiatives for wind farms and things like that, all of that. And then on the other hand, you have people who love their car, love their sausages, and love having ever warmer, bigger flats. And the two, you know, you can't necessarily have the two. So the question is, you know, responsible, what would that mean? And I think 21, 22, and 23 have shown the limits to which the German government is willing to go. And I do think, I mean, it's not just a question of not having learned being responsible, but I think for a long time, and particularly under Merkel, the German population was told, you can have a good life, don't worry, things will be fine. And so when it comes to taking action, such as with regard to the environment, it was delegated towards technologies, away from people. So people were told, you don't need to change your lives. I mean, this wind farm will take care of that. But that's, of course, an illusion if you take gas and oil from Russia, or since then, go to African countries or places like Qatar. You know, they're not nice places necessarily. So the responsibility, I think, is a tough one, unless I think German society remembers that actually sometimes you need to make sacrifices. And there are plenty of examples in the book. So post-war reconstruction entailed huge sacrifices for many, many groups in society. So it's not that things were always easy. And my hunch is the current government will find it very hard to gather support for future policies unless there is a kind of collective ideal to which people can subscribe to that will justify why being responsible is good. But at the moment you have you know, the farmers are a typical example. You have private interests saying, well, this is hurting me, I'm going to protest. But there's little talk about a shared public interest.
I'm very interested in that idea. I will come back to the floor in a second, but if I could just quickly pose a question prompted by the title of framing of your book. You chose not to use Stunde Null as the starting point, but it does seem to me that in German identity, Stunde Null still has an important role to play. And you might think that would be fading with the generation who experienced the reconstruction no longer being so much with us. But then if you look at statements like Robert Habeck's comments on the Hamas attacks, there is still this public resonance of the idea of a new reason of state, that something started again in Germany after the Holocaust. So I just wondered if you could say something about what Stunde Null means now as it drifts, that Stunde Null drifts further into the past.
Well, I think short answer would be to say you get German language lessons in this evening as well. Stunde Null, so hour zero, is connected also to the talk of nie wieder, never again, where the current threats are given a historical framing that imply if you don't act, you end up before hour zero. You end up in the darkness. I find that personally and historically quite wild, I have to say, because the 30s and anti-Semitism under the Nazis is something quite different from anti-Semitism now. I mean, state-sponsored anti-Semitism. There are many deficits and oversights, but anti-Semitism isn't state-sponsored in Germany now. But the interesting thing is, as you say, this narrative which continues, where supposedly all the lessons were learned after 45, and for many people really believe that all the lessons were learned after 68. And what gets written out is that you have in the 50s, you don't just have people who want to get another German word, who want to draw a so-called Schlussstrich, a line, say, well, enough about this talk of the war and so forth. Let's look to the future. We don't want to talk about this anymore. Let's just have amnesties and move on. You have those people, but already in the 50s, you have a counter response by civil society groups. So the first groups who visit Bergen-Belsen concentration camp are in the early 1950s of jazz clubs and you spend their entire membership fees on hiring coaches to go to Bergen-Belsen. The Diary of Anne Frank is turned into a play. That play is the most widely seen play in post-war German history. Yeah? And that's mid-late 1950s. So what the Hour Zero narrative also, I think, misses is that this new identity and this new public memory and sense of what it means German is really the result of an ongoing struggle. It's not, Hour Zero suggests clean break and then we go. One last point I would say, and goes back to your question, also about to what degree there were things sort of deep-rooted in the German character. I think it's important to recognize the Weimar experience, not just as a failure, but many democratic politicians after 45, and that includes the so-called fathers, constitutional fathers, but there were also mothers who helped writing the German constitutions, were socialized politically in the 1920s. So they had been active in democratic politics. So it's not, so 45 is, Hour Zero is also wrong in the sense that it doesn't give credit to pre-existing democratic experiences and democratic lifelines. There was in the back.
Yes, question at the back. If there is another one, we'd be happy to collect questions. Yes, there's some questions at the front too. So I'll give the mic at the front. Yes.
Thank you for your talk. I just wondered if you could expand a little bit on your last comments about the AfD and their support has doubled roughly in the last 10 years. It's over 20%, even after the demonstrations. With Le Pen maybe coming to power in France, we've got a post-fascist or neo-fascist government in Italy. We've got Argentina, where Trump's going to probably come back. I just wondered what you saw the future for the AfD and the wider, political scene in Germany in the near future.
One more for now, but I will come back to you. Yes.
Thank you. Slightly linked. You had such an interesting variety of sources. Thank you. One I was very interested in was you mentioned the survey done, I think it was by Leipzig, by an institute there, asking when hearts and minds in the West and East might unite. If you were asked that question, how would you answer that?
Yeah. I would not want to minimize the threat the alternative for Germany poses. So I should preface that. At the same time, I think it's sort of vital to recognize while they're all populists and also have even fascist elements, it's also populism with what I call German characteristics. So it's also differences to Le Pen and Le Pen supporters or the Italian situation. So one big difference is, for instance, that the gap in standards of living between the eastern states, where the AfD in current polls stands around 30 to 35%, the gap to the richer parts of the West are actually narrow and small compared to if you look at the gaps between the deindustrialized parts of France and rich parts in Paris, or between South Wales and London, or between Northern Italy and Southern Italy. So one interesting thing about the AfD is that materially speaking, most AfD supporters, they're not poor, they're not declining. What they have is a fear. They have a fear of declining. I think that's very, very important. You had in the weekly paper Die Zeit, you had a whole page of an interview with a person who had written letters to the paper, who they then interviewed, who said, next time I'm going to vote for the AfD. They met with this person in his holiday home big holiday home in, I think, somewhere in Spain or so, where he was just golfing all the time. And he said, I'm not poor. I'm a doctor or something like that. I have tons of money. It's not about money at all. So I think that's one thing I would note. The interesting thing, as you pointed out, is that the demonstrations, the mass demonstration against hatred and racism and far-right politics have not so far done much to put a dent in the support of the AfD. Why is that? Well, let me give you one figure. In Saxony, so that's the state around Dresden, which is one of the places where there will be elections in the autumn. When I was doing this book, I thought, oh, it might be interesting actually to look at what happens to the democratic parties who win the elections in 1990 and after unification. What happens to them? And so I started looking at figures about party membership at the regional and local level. And I first thought, these tables, there must be somewhere at the bottom or at the end, it must mean thousands, because the number of members, the Liberal Party, the Social Democratic Party, the Christian Democratic Party, and the Green Party have together, you can more or less count on one hand. So in Saxony, all the democratic parties together don't even just have over 10,000 members. Yeah, so effectively what I'm saying is, in terms of political culture, you have a vacuum. So after reunification, the Western parties always happy to campaign during election time, but between elections, they never set a foot down. They do not manage to establish themselves. So there is a sort of vacuum, which made it, and then on top of it, you have austerity measures, so cut back on public institutions, spaces, democratic clubs, and so forth. So you have a vacuum which can be easily taken over by the AfD, and they did it. Better organized, early users of social media. So that's one thing. The second thing is what the AfD does. It serves this conviction that which is widespread in East Germany, but also in parts of West Germany, we're being ignored. No one listens to us. Berlin doesn't care what's happening to us. And so this sense of always being victim of policies. Goes back to your point about responsibility. The problem with responsibility also lies with West Germans and particularly with East Germans who have been pretty reluctant in most cases to confront their role during the GDR. So their relationship during their everyday life with dictatorial rule. And what has happened is that more than ever, perhaps in the last few years, you have people call it ostalgie, sort of nostalgia for the East. You have this idea that, well, GDR was a dictatorial regime, it was a bad regime, but that was the ruling party and Honecker and the Stasi. We had an everyday life, we lived good lives, we tried to be good people, as if these two were separate worlds. And that makes it very hard, I think, for a sort of honest dialogue between West and East Germans. West Germans also have their blind spots, that's for sure. So the AfD, I think, at the moment will probably get those 30%. I see no reason why not. The democratic parties so far have pretty much a negative campaign. And I've said this recently in German newspapers, the big problem is not this so-called firewall. We're having a firewall to fascists. Yeah, you can have a firewall not talking to fascists all the time, but you also need to build bridges to people who are not yet fascist, who are toying with voting for the populists, who feel and are often excluded from any dialogues. Unless you rebuild these bridges, you will create separate political milieus, and it will be very hard to win them back, which means that where do I stand on the East and West? Well, you see, I don't have many personal investments in this question. I grew up in Hamburg, which was West Germany, but I left the country before the wall even came down. So I've become a kind of observer of these things, and I have friends but who are both grew up in the East and friends who grew up in the West. What I find very troubling and worrying is that the question of authenticity, which we've seen on other political topics as well, is particularly acute when there are debates about East and West. So I have a good friend who grew up in West Germany, who runs a research center in Potsdam, which is in the East, who's married to an East German. When I first said to him, look, there are these debates about what kind of regime is the GDR. Why don't you say it's a dictatorship? He says, well, I can't say this. I said, well, you lived here for a long time. You're married to an East German. He said, no. I get automatically castigated as a West German who doesn't know. And I think that's sad. You should be able to talk about topics, even if you haven't personally experienced them. I mean, otherwise we wouldn't have history, right? I mean, you can't write Roman history because you weren't there in Roman times. Only Caesar can write about the Gallic Wars, no one after. It's sad, but there is this claim to only being able to speak about it if you've lived through it. And that creates a very narrow and often biased way of looking at it and makes dialogue and democratic exchange difficult.
I've been so immersed in the Q&A that I have only just noticed that we've gone over time. So, Madam, I'm afraid your question is going to have to be the last one. And I do want to point out that after the talk, Frank's book will be on sale. And the price is brilliant. So it's £28 down from an RRP of £40. So if you do want to get a book, I think, Frank, you'll be happy to stay around and sign some. But yes, the final question.
It's slightly off topic, but I'm just wondering to what extent do you consider the denazification program to have been successful, and how could the model be replicated elsewhere, such as in the Palestinian territories?
Well, thank you. An American philosopher based in Berlin in 2019 or 2020, her name is Susan Neiman, wrote a book about what we can learn from the Germans. And her idea there with the book was that Americans in particular, with regards to how they've been handling slavery and racism, could learn from how the Germans over time have learned to confront the past. Her answer in that book was that the East Germans did a really brilliant job and the West Germans failed. I mean, I simplify a little bit, but if you scratch, the interesting thing about denazification is how as long as West and East Germany were under occupation, if you look at numbers for the American zones and the Soviet zone, so 46, 47, 48, tremendous denazification, huge numbers of trials, huge numbers of convictions, many of those passed down by German courts. So even though you have occupation, you also have German courts looking after it. That then turns around after 1949 into a wave of amnesties. So the minute West Germany and East Germany are founded, both states, again, almost in parallel, say, well, we recognize 90% of the population was, people say at the time, 90% of the population was backing Hitler. We can't run and rebuild a society if we lock up 90%. It's just not possible. So we must come to some arrangement. So in Germany, you have a lot of amnesties. In East Germany, you have a new party, which is especially established for former Nazis, who can proclaim, oh, we've been sinners, but we're now realizing we really want to build socialism. And as long as you're prepared to do that, you're fine. The difference, there are differences between East and West. The differences are which bits of the state system is being denazified. So in West Germany, many former judges and prosecutors who were active in the 30s and early 40s are reinstituted in their jobs in the 1950s. Foreign office, diplomatic service, very high degree. In East Germany, you get rid of the judges and you introduce so-called people's judges who are fast-tracked and given courts. You get rid of Nazis in those positions which are critical to a socialist regime, but go down to schools, school teachers, directors, the police, and so forth. Very, very widespread ongoing Nazis. So it depends on where you look. Personally, if you step back and look at the rest of Europe, it's interesting how different countries dealt with collaborators and fascists. So in some countries, I think Netherlands is one, I think you have them stripped of all sorts of civic rights. They're prevented from going into professions. I mean, several 100,000 people we're talking about, you know? And as we know, I mean, Netherlands is a pretty rich and progressive country in many ways. So the argument used by Adenauer that, wow, we couldn't do more because then we couldn't have rebuilt the country, needs to be taken with a word of caution. More could have been done without, I think, risking economic reconstruction. But in defense of Adenauer, one also has to remember that denazification is being slowed down after a number of years. So in 1945, 46, 47, you have huge numbers of former Nazis and soldiers who are in internment camps. They lose several years of their lives and of their career. So when they come out, certainly regional leaders of the Nazi party, when they come out, their status, their social status is gone. So you have cases, you know, of Gauleiter, so regional Nazi leader, who keeps going to court to get all his rights and liberties back into the early 50s. He's being reduced to becoming a traveling salesman for liqueur. His wife has to clean the dishes in the local restaurant. That's a pretty steep fall for someone like that. So yes, you have amnesties, but the people who get the amnesty, you know, they can't believe their luck. They say, well, gosh, that was scary. I almost lost my entire life and status and situation. Thank God I get my pension back. So as I say in the book, you know, by that point, they want to put on slippers, not jackboots. So the way the early years really send strong signals and are pretty punitive is depriving any person, not any person, but the majority of people who previously toyed with National Socialism say, no, okay, I stay out of politics and I just do my job as an administrator, bureaucrat, but I'm not gonna start or join another party. And the few people who try, locals just laugh at them. You know.
Thank you for that. And it's excellent to end on such a reflection on what the past can mean for the present. It's an absolutely fascinating book. I do encourage you to stay and get your copy because it's brilliant. I want to thank you on behalf of the Wiener Library and also our partners, the Birkbeck Institute for the Study of Antisemitism. And on behalf of everyone here, thank you very much, Frank.